Reflection, Chapter 10. They found themselves at the bottom of a stony hill, a short distance from the tower of the last glance to home. There was something lonely about the tower, Mulan felt. Other than its brightly painted walls, its faded scarlet windows and yellow roofs, it reminded her of one of the austere watchtowers she'd seen in paintings of the Great Wall protecting China. Shishi was quiet. Mulan supposed seeing the general spirit in Dayu had had a profound effect on him. The sky shifted above them, lighting into a dismal gray. The moon remained, though. It was paler and softer than the moon she'd used to see in the living world, as if someone had pulled a swath of gauze over its face. Mulan inhaled. A familiar, spiced smell lingered in the air. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. "Do you smell that?" Shishi nodded. "Incense." From the top of the tower, Mulan thought, gazing up. At the tower's base was a small rectangular opening, too narrow for Shishi to enter. Mulan and Shishi exchanged a glance. She'd have to go alone. The guardian frowned but didn't argue. "Remember what General Li told you, and don't take your time." Mulan gave a curt nod. "Ping," Shishi added. "Don't tell Li Shang about King Yama's deal just yet. Give him some hope. He needs something to live for." Mulan tilted her head, touched by the lion's thoughtfulness. "All right." She hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want to come?" "Even if I could, it wouldn't be right." "Why not?" "Why?" Shishi blustered. "Because—" He stopped. "Why should I bother explaining to you the intricacies between guardian and man? Your guardian is a house lizard. Enough of this. Go, go." Not needing to be told twice, Mulan hurried up the stairs. The smell of incense grew stronger, heavier, and higher she went. She used to make her sleepy when it was a child. Back then, Grandmother Fa once took her to their family temple to pray for their ancestors. Young Mulan had always had to stifle a yawn when it came to her turn to hold the incense and bow to the ancestor spirits at the altar. But now she was anything but sleepy. Her adrenaline high, she ran faster, ignoring the flickering shadows from the candles, tracing her figure as her boots drummed up the cold stone steps. She wished she left her armor downstairs with Shishi. Wearing an extra 40 jin slowed her down, and she didn't slacken her pace, training her eyes on the wooden door at the top of the stairs. It was slightly ajar, and light slanted out of the opening. Shang had to be there. Panting, Mulan reached for the last step. She caught her breath, collected herself, and stepped into the room. The lighting was dim. Incense burned with the thin stick stacked with lone tangerines surrounding by candles and bronze cups. An altar for worshipping the dead, Mulan thought. But that wasn't the sight that made her shiver. Her knees locked in place. Her muscles froze. Shang leaned against the wall, staring out the window at the world outside. He didn't turn around when she came in. He didn't even seem to hear her. At first glance, he looked the same as when she had first met him. Thick black hair tied into a neat knot behind his head, cape fastened at the collar, thrown over his shoulder, armor polished and free of tarnish, and blood. Except, Shang was a spirit. Mulan's hand jumped to her mouth. No. There was no denying it. Shang glowed a soft pale blue, and his body flickered like a watery reflection. She could see the window's geometric lattice work through his skin. "Shang," she tried to call. Her voice came out strangled and hoarse. The room was small, barely a dozen strides wide and long. She moved toward him, but he didn't budge. "Shang?" What was he staring at? All she saw outside the window was a dreary gray sky. There wasn't a cloud or a bird in sight. He must see something else. Worry etched itself in her brow. Shang's eyes were glassy, and not even a muscle in his jaw twitched when she called his name. She wanted to shake his shoulders, but she couldn't even touch him. She tried anyway, resting her hand above his arm. It was like touching warm water. "Am I too late?" "Shang, I'm here. It's Ping." He must have felt something, because finally Shang turned. When he saw her, his brow lifted. It was a small gesture, but Mulan's heart fluttered with relief. He was happy to see her. Then Shang blinked, and his lips twisted into a grimace. He wrung his hands. Not you too, Ping. Mulan's eyes widened, suddenly understanding what Shane must think. No, she said. I'm alive. Shang shook his head. Not if you're here. Shang, I'm here to take you home. Ping, look around you. We're in the underworld. Yes, she agreed, but I'm not dead. Your father's spirit came to me. He brought me to your family guardian, Shishi. He's right downstairs if you just come with me. Ping, Shang said, raising his voice harshly. This is the last chance I get to see my family. I'd like to be alone. I spoke to your father, she repeated. He said you wouldn't believe me. You should have listened. Shang set his gaze back toward the window. Go. I don't have long here, and I want to remember as much as I can. So you know? She said. King Yama told you that you're leaving Dayu? I know my body is dying, Shang said flatly. I know that I have been chosen to return to Earth. It's an honor. I only hope in my next life I can continue protecting China. You must protect China in this life, Mulan said. I'm really here, Shang. No, Ping. His brows knit, and he wore a pained expression. If you're here, that means you're dying too, and I'm sorry to hear that. You should be in your own tower. Mulan gritted her teeth. She'd forgotten how stubborn Shang could be. Almost more stubborn than she was. Almost, but not quite. She wasn't giving up on him. Help him remember. Help him believe. You promised I had your trust, right? She said softly. That got Shang's attention. He looked at her uncertainly. Your father wants you to live, Shang. I know you think it's dishonorable to try to fight your fate, but you must. We still need you. Your soldiers need you. She paused. Remember how hopeless we were all at the beginning? Shang let out a laugh. It was brusque, but Mulan went on, encouraged. Do you remember when we first met? How could I forget? You were the worst soldier I'd ever seen. It was Mulan's turn to laugh. Sometimes she wished she could forget the first time she'd met Shang. Mushu had given her a few questionable lessons on how to behave like a man, so she'd lumbered into the training barracks and somehow gotten into a fight with every other recruit. Shang had arrived to break up the scuffle, and there she was, curled up on the ground like a turtle, covering her head so the other soldiers wouldn't batter it. The sight of him had taken her breath away. Not because he was tall and imposing and handsome, but because she'd been out of shape and jumped too quickly to her feet. I was so afraid of you, I didn't even remember my own name, Mulan confessed. It was mostly the truth. Honestly, she hadn't even come up with a male name yet, but she had been terrified of him. Terrified and curious. After all, the expression Shang had worn when they first met, she couldn't tell whether he'd been angry or perplexed, or both. What an idiot he must have thought she was. She was better at reading his expressions now. The crook in his neck. He was listening. The slight bent in his arm when he spoke to her. He was cautious. The parting of his lips when he was waiting for her to speak. He was hopeful. Doubt still lingered in his eyes, but he wanted to believe her. Are you still afraid of me? Asked Shane. Especially now that I'm like this? He held up his pale blue arms. No, said Mulan. Now I'm just afraid I'll lose my friend, and Yao and Ling and Qianpo, we're worried that we'll lose our captain. Who else would work us so hard? You have to fight, Shang. It's what you taught us to do. The hardness in his eyes softened. Is it really you, Ping? I know it's hard to believe, but it is. And my father truly sent you here to bring me back? He guessed you'd be skeptical. He knows you well. Mulan paused. He asked me to tell you a story from when you were a child in case you didn't believe me. What story? You said when you were 6 you sneaked into his trunk and tried to follow him to battle. He caught you and he promised that one day you would fight together. Mulan hesitated. He said he's sorry that never got to happen. The flinch in Shang's brow was brief, but Mulan caught it. His shoulders tensed and drew up. Is he here? In Dayu? Can I speak to him? I don't know where he is. He said he has to go to heaven. Shang's shoulders dropped. his face relieved, yet sad. I see. He wants you to live, Shang, Mulan went on. Your family guardian brought me here to take you home. He's downstairs waiting for us. Shang lowered his gaze to study her. His eyes wavered as they searched her face. She could tell he wanted to believe her. You can't be real. I am, she said. Shang, you have to believe me. You have to live. Why? Why? She repeated to herself. Her mind scrambled for an answer. My father used to tell me about the ancient heroes who protected China against demons, how the gods gave them magical stones or lanterns or swords to help them with their quests. But even then the heroes weren't invincible. They knew fear and loss, yet they fought anyway, because they knew it was the right thing to do, because in their hearts they were brave and true. She bit her lip, reflecting on her father's stories. The heroes had always inspired her, even if none of them had been girls. That's not the point now, she reminded herself. I've got to make Shang want to live. We're just men, Shang. We have no magic, but we have our courage and we have our strength. China needs us. You might have guessed that I was a disappointment to my parents. I was clumsy and stubborn and unhappy with myself. I didn't know what I lived for. I didn't know who I was. Sometimes I still don't. She paused, feeling a lump rise in her throat. But it isn't always about me. It's about China, my family, my friends. I chose to come to Dayu to take you home. You need to make that choice now, too. If you think your path ends here, I'll go. But if you want to keep going, come with me. She waited for Shang to absorb her words. That sounds more like the real Ping, he said finally, peeling himself from the window. He sounded calm, the way he always had when he commanded his troops, but his next words carried a note of urgency. So, how do we get out of here? Mulan smiled. That was the Shang she knew. Follow me, she said, moving to the door. But as soon as Shang stepped out of the room, the walls let out a terrible shudder, and the ground below shook. The tower's crumbling. Shang reached to grab Mulan's arm, but his touch was no more than a shadow. His face twisted with a mix of sadness and frustration. But then he looked at her, jaw set determinedly. Let's go. Mulan bolted down the stairs, taking 2-3 steps at a time. She could hear the stones collapsing as if someone had taken a giant hammer to the roof. The sound thundered around her. There were maybe 20 steps from the bottom when Mulan spied Shishi pacing at the entrance. They were almost there. Then the stairs flattened beneath their feet, and down they slid, just seconds ahead of an avalanche of crumbling stones. They were going to crash into the wall. They kicked at the ground, trying to slow their fall, but it was in vain. Seeing that they were in danger, Shishi smashed through the entrance and charged in front of Mulan and Shang, breaking their fall and bearing the falling stones on his back. But before he could snatch Mulan in his teeth and take her outside, the tower floor disappeared. Into the void, the three of them plunged, and Shishi's roar echoed as they fell deeper and deeper into Dayu.